following is a production of Temple University Beasley School of Law.
Well, hello everybody. I'm Rob Bartow, and I think all of you know that. And I'm delighted to be here with Murray. Murray and I go way back. We've known each other for a long, long time. Some of you know Murray's history quite well, but I know many of you don't. Some of the newer faculty members, the students certainly don't. Murray, I'd like to start by taking you back to 1933. 1933, you're here at Temple University as an undergrad. Yeah. You're about ready to graduate. The law school had been, until that point, had been just an evening program. And in that year, they decided to launch a full-time day program, and you were one of those first students.
I was in the first class of the full-day program, and our law school was in the Ledger building. And when the presses worked, the professor stopped lecturing for the moment.
What inspired you to become a lawyer? Why did you decide to go to law school?
Well, there was no real inspiration. It wasn't that I had someone who persuaded me to go in this area, and then no incident which would be a reason. Actually, the circles in which my family moved, there were only two professions. You either became a doctor or a lawyer. A lawyer was a Jewish boy who couldn't stand the sight of blood. Otherwise, he would have been a doctor. And you didn't like blood, huh? Because being a doctor was a much better profession. Well, I don't know, maybe I fell into that category. Though I was told that when I was a youngster, I would continue to argue with my parents to try to achieve what I wanted. Anyhow, when I got into high school, I got on the debating team and we won the city championship. And I knew then that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I was captain of the debating team at college, and I was certain I was going to be a lawyer. Yeah. And that's what happened.
Excellent, excellent. Why business law? What got you into business and real estate?
In my judgment, you don't choose the area of law in which you're going to practice. It's the area of law that chooses you. When I was in law school, if I had been asked, what are you going to do? I would say, I'm going to be a litigator. There was no doubt in my mind. I had visions of standing before the jury and making impassioned speeches and so on, all that. Well, when I graduated in 1936, there were only two Jewish firms in the city, Wolf Block, Shore and Solis Cohen, and the Obermeyer. All of the large firms, there wasn't a single Jew that was hired by, or a single African American, I'm sure, that was hired by these firms. So that even though I graduated with honors, I wouldn't have thought for a second to apply to firm Dwayne Morris or any of those firms.
Any of those.
And this was during the Depression when I graduated. You had a couple of 2 or 3 fellows who would have a partnership, but they couldn't afford to pay anybody. It was during the Depression. And fortunately, Dean Hervey, who was the dean then, recommended me for a job. And I became counsel for the Bureau of Municipal Research. The Bureau is an agency like the Committee of 70, only with much broader areas of concern. And at first I went with my boss, and later on they let me go on my own to meet with all sorts of city and state officials. And it was, at that time, I was also active with the liberal democratic group. And it's where I met Joe Clark and Dick Dilworth and so on. And I worked, and it was very interesting. I was also the legislative reporter. And, but the compensation was minimal. And so through the organizations that I belonged to, someone recommended me for a job to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the RFC. The RFC was started by Hoover to help us get out of the Depression. The RFC made loans to businesses, but the only way we could make a loan to a business if they showed us that they were turned down by the bank, because we weren't competing with the banks. As a matter of fact, at one point, the RFC had control of most of the banks. Well, I learned more at the RFC than in all my 3 years of law school. The only way you could make a loan, you had to take as much collateral as you possibly could, so that when a borrower came in, I had to prepare a note. We got a mortgage on all his property. We got an assignment of his life insurance. Everything that they had, we had assignment of the accounts receivable. And so I learned how to prepare those papers. As a matter of fact, the papers really had been prepared. We had perfect papers, and I learned a lot from the papers,
Yes.
the documents that they had. And so, in addition to that, frequently some of these businesses went broke. I had to go down to court in Delaware, where I had to fight with the bankrupt trustee, because the trustee wanted to take the assets. We argued that the loan that we made far exceeded the equity that was still in that property, and so I had to protect. And it was a very informative period of time. Well, as I said before, I was active in the liberal part of the Democratic Party. And you remember Joe Clark was
Absolutely.
elected mayor.
Yeah.
Joe Clark appointed Abe Friedman as his city solicitor. Abe Friedman was my professor at law school. And I also knew him through the various organizations. I was very active in organizations. And so Abe called me and asked me if I wanted to be an assistant. And so I became an assistant city solicitor, and thereafter I became his deputy. And during that time, I represented the city on all legislative matters. As a matter of fact, I have a letter at home from Joe Clark which says, to whom it may concern, Murray H. Shusterman, Deputy City Solicitor, is authorized to speak on behalf of my administration on all legislative matters. And I used to go to Harrisburg and sit in on the caucus and explain what the mayor's position was. Well, at that time, it's no longer true, you could be a part-time deputy city solicitor. So half of the time I was in the office from 9 to 12, 8:30 to 12, but I was always available, and many times I would get a call in my private office from Joe Clark or Abe Friedman or others who had one. And that's the time I began developing my practice. Well, why business planning and why real estate? A friend of mine in an organization recommended a businessman to me. And this was really the first business client. And we met, and fortunately, I did very well. He was very well satisfied, and he recommended someone else. And pretty soon, I was very anxious to succeed, and I learned about the business, and I knew exactly what I was going to say. And then a cousin of mine, who bought little pieces of real estate, was buying a big property, and he decided he better use a lawyer this time instead of just the real estate broker. I represented him, and he was quite satisfied, and he recommended me to one of his associates who's also in the real estate business. And pretty soon, I began representing him more and more, and after a while, this cousin of mine ended up owning some of the largest hotels in Atlantic City, and I was his lawyer. And once people learned that I was handling that kind of stuff, and it got to the point where the little partnership that I formed with 3 people, they said, "Murray, you've got to stop the city solicitor nonsense that you were interested in." And so I gave up the city solicitor's office. They were very nice to me. The mayor and the others, they sent letters, and the council passed resolutions and all that nonsense. And I began practicing law full time.
What sort of business law, real estate law courses were available to you when you were a student?
You must remember that I graduated in 1936, before any of you were born. And that's a fact.
That's a fact.
That was over 70 years ago. I can't say that I remember distinctly, but I do know we had contracts was the first course that everybody took. I suppose it's true today. Then we had 2 separate courses, one for real property, another one for personal property. We had a course called Equity, and in that course we learned about administration of estates, we learned about taxation, we learned about investments, and incidentally, let me tell you, this is a true story. In a very pontifical tone, he said, "Gentlemen, when you're a trustee or an executor, you have to be very careful about the investments that you make. And I would suggest that you don't take chances. I would suggest you invest in Pennsylvania Railroad." And he mentioned 3 of them, which 20 years later no longer existed.
That was helpful.
We had, every one of the students took domestic relations. But I'll tell you, we did not have the fancy courses that you have now. To the best of my knowledge, we didn't have a course on environmental law. To the best of my knowledge, we didn't have a course on intellectual property. And you have a lot of courses now that students have an opportunity to learn various areas. But nevertheless, Rob, all of us felt that we got a very good legal education in terms of practicing law at that time.
At some point, you were asked to come and be an adjunct professor. What did you want your students to take away from your business planning course? How did you structure it?
Well, I would hope that the student would take away with him a substantial amount of the text and knowledge that he was exposed to, or she was exposed to. I say she. When in my first few classes, I only had 1 female. When I finished teaching, half of my class were females. Right. And that's why it's been a revolution in that regard. I tell you, I always made, at the beginning of the session, I would say to my students, you'll forgive me if I do things that seem to be childish. First of all, I expect you to stand every time I call on you to recite, because you're going to have to do that when you're in court. You're not going to be sitting. Secondly, I want you to, this would be at the first session, I said, I want you to take any seat that you want, but that's going to be your seat for the rest of the, because I'm going to have a chart. Instead of saying, hey, you, I want to say George, Mr. Smith, or whatever it is, on a personal basis. I had a very good relationship with the students, and one of the things that I always wanted them to learn, and that is the art of negotiations. To me, that's a sine qua non of the practice of law. Whether you represent a plaintiff who is arguing and negotiating with an insurance adjuster, or whether you're representing a businessman who is buying a competitor, the art of negotiation is very important.
Definitely.
And I always said, when you negotiate, be firm but fair. And don't exaggerate when you're trying to sell your client's business. Don't, because if you keep on exaggerating, after a while, he will discount even the facts that you present that are absolutely true. Anyhow, we had always had a good relationship.
Excellent. I know the story of how you got involved teaching real estate transactions, but would you tell everybody the story of how you came to teach real estate transactions at Temple?
I taught business planning for a period of 10 years, and I enjoyed teaching that course. I felt it was something that the students were going to take away with them that would help them in the practice of law. Well, I was preparing, this was the 10th year that I was teaching, and I was home preparing. It would take me 2 weeks nights, because I was still practicing, to prepare examinations. And I said to my wife, you know, this is the last time that I'm preparing exams, because the students have the ability to go to the library and see what exams I gave. And if they can go over and answer all the questions that I asked for 10 years, I'm satisfied. I'm not going to prepare anymore. It's literally true. 2 days later, the dean called me in. He said, Murray, will you do me a favor? I said, if I can, I will. He said, you know, Hackenberg had a heart attack, and he was the one who was teaching real estate. I know how extensive a practice you have on real estate. Will you take the course? And then I told him the story. He says, only for 1 year. And that 1 year lasted 10 years that I taught real estate.
That's right. Excellent, excellent. So do you have any thoughts for us on you know, as we have some members of the curriculum committee here, we have some business faculty, students very interested in business.
I'm glad to have the opportunity of meeting some of these professors. Some of the professors I've known for many, many years.
Yes, indeed.
But I really thought that the purpose of this meeting was to acquaint me with the various courses that are being taught today. And I just had a smattering knowledge, and I hope that later on the various professors will share with me the breadth and width of the courses that they're teaching.
That's excellent. Well, thank you very much, Murray.